When we play video games, we tend to remember only the best or the worst parts. If a game is great, then we'll typically excuse most of its flaws because we have such fond memories of it. When a game is especially bad, the flaws tend to stick with us and to form our impression of the game as a whole. Morrowind is in the former category. It is widely praised as the best Elder Scrolls game, and I think that characterization is accurate for a number of reasons. However, a lot of people are looking back with rose-tinted glasses, and they tend to forget that Morrowind is, in many ways, a very weak game, especially in comparison to other RPGs, such as Baldur's Gate, The Witcher 3, or Divinity: Original Sin. In this video, I'm going to be critical of Morrowind. I'm going to expose and to critique its shortcomings systematically. I want to preface this by acknowledging that I do really love Morrowind. It is definitely a good game. I don't want to dissuade you from playing it if you haven't already, because it is one of the best games of all time. When I say that Morrowind is overrated, I'm essentially saying that a good thing is being rated even more highly than it should be, which isn't necessarily a bad sign. My statement is just one of sobriety and clarity. People are so enamored with Morrowind that they're often taking it uncritically, but nevertheless, the depth of its lore and the quality of its writing, where it counts, is outstanding in the genre. Its art style and setting makes it timeless, leaving us no problems in enjoying the game, despite its primitive graphics over a decade later. And in comparison with its successors, it did at least attempt to present to the player a proper role-playing game, however flawed the actual systems are in reality. This is a beloved game for so many reasons, and there are enough retrospectives of it on YouTube that you can watch if you want to see someone praising it. But despite what you might think, I'm not always a fan of spear polishing. After revisiting the game recently with a more critical mindset, I've begun to realize that I had forgotten a lot of the game's weaknesses and some of its lowest moments. Gradually, I began to not appreciate it. I found it to be underdeveloped, mostly empty, and full of loose ends, possessing only superficial charm. Its RPG mechanics, while praised by most, and definitely at least more complicated than those in successive games, began to show their weaknesses to me. A fundamental lack of transparency, choice, depth, consistency, and generally the absence of a decisive intention and design. And worst of all, my opinion of the game's quests, and even some of its writing decisions, began to decline as I've continued to play it. When we look under the surface, we realize that the quest design is quite rudimentary, and even sometimes tedious for the player. But first, some background on the game's development cycle, which might shed some light on why this is. Morrowind was developed over the short course of about 3 years by a small team of 40 people, literally in a basement. The first year was spent developing the game's toolset, the construction set, and so the developers only had about 2 years to flesh out the game, which is the same length as Fallout New Vegas' development cycle. New Vegas, of course, suffers from underdevelopment as well. Morrowind was underfunded, and the publisher was teetering on the brink of financial failure. Nevertheless, Todd Howard convinced the developers to double down, and eventually, they managed to release it to critical acclaim and to a great audience reception, despite the difficulties. This hasty launch required a lot of streamlining and cutting. Morrowind was originally going to be a very different game. It was supposed to encompass the entirety of mainland Morrowind, but the developers later restricted it to just the island of Vardenfell. The lead developer, Ken Rolston, was quite ambitious for Morrowind and had a long dossier for practically every little character, detailing their backgrounds and personality traits as pointed out in the Polygon article. Had Morrowind more time in the oven, it could have been fleshed out to the utmost degree, but that didn't happen. The devs were forced to hunker down and to simplify the world and the exposition for the sake of getting a game out in a reasonable amount of time. Although we likely would not have had Morrowind at all if this weren't done, this was still to its great detriment, since it could have been even better than it is. I don't think I would be making a video like this if it had even just a couple of years more development time. The fact is, Morrowind has a lot of loose ends, as I've mentioned, owing to its short development cycle and its small staff. There are characters everywhere, but they're mostly indistinguishable from one another. They're the very embodiment of NPC. Almost all of them spout the same boilerplate dialogue, which is drawn from a small pool of standardized responses. Ask a random townsperson about their background, and they will deliver to you a stock response about their class. Ask for rumors, and every NPC will give you more or less the same lines, depending on which town you're in, just like in Oblivion. Only characters critical to the main quest have a reasonable degree of exposition. Even though Morrowind has a relatively advanced dialogue system compared to Oblivion and Skyrim, it is woefully underutilized. Even most of the skills constitute loose ends because they aren't very mechanically deep, properly itemized, nor even terribly useful, which is one of the first points I will be addressing. The stealth skills are the worst in this regard. In further Elder Scrolls games and even Bethesda Fallout titles, Bethesda Game Studios has explicitly decided to streamline the games in terms of mechanics, gameplay, and narrative. I don't remember where I heard this, but one developer phrased it as something like, "We always ask not what we can add to the game, but what we can remove from it." It's fair to criticize Bethesda for this because, in a lot of ways, it's as if they're just giving up on improving the game's shortcomings, opting to simply remove the offending features instead. The games would be much better, and I think most fans agree with this, if Bethesda would just spend a little bit more time fleshing them out, rather than developing with a hacksaw. But I don't think that'll happen. Companies have realized since insert world-changing event here, that cutting costs is a superior way to improve profits than providing better services. Not only is it easier for the developers to streamline the games, but it's also better for investors since there is much less overhead and more mass appeal. What makes the most money is not necessarily what makes the best art, and the only consequence of the profit motive has been the generation of greater profit, even at the expense of the products and services in question. On the other hand, I actually think that the decision to streamline the titles wasn't all that bad, definitely not as bad as most people are making it out to be. The alternative, which was to ramp up the depth and complexity, as always, would have been better, but considering what actually happened versus what we actually wanted, all in all, it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Streamlining can be done well, or it can be done poorly. It's very easy to cut out too much from the games, as happened in the Elder Scrolls Redguard or Battlespire, which were both essentially just adventure games rather than RPGs. And obviously, streamlining can be done right. You can get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, get rid of the stuff that isn't fun nor necessary, and focus on what remains. This is what Bethesda has done for the most part. Skyrim was streamlined responsibly, and by that I mean they didn't cut out anything that was crucial to the game experience. Despite the absence of deep RPG mechanics, it still remains an enjoyable game. That's something of an accomplishment, to create the impression of a role-playing game without any serious role-playing mechanics. A running theme in this critique will be that most of Morrowind's systems aren't very deep nor developed, and so getting rid of them wouldn't substantially impact the core gameplay experience, nor would it hurt any of the other things that make Morrowind a compelling game. The main issue with the future Elder Scrolls titles isn't that they don't have this or that game mechanic, but rather, what the developers did with what's left wasn't very masterful nor competent. Fallout New Vegas is a great example of this fact. New Vegas is not much more mechanically complex than Fallout 3, and it shared all of the streamlining that took place in the Bethesda Fallout game, but the writing, world building, aesthetics, and the implementation of the systems that remained was astronomically better than in Fallout 3. Therefore, the streamlining itself is not necessarily terrible, and I think the poor implementation of various features in Morrowind means that, even if those systems did exist, they weren't necessarily very compelling by merely existing. First, let's address gameplay, which is easily the weakest link in Morrowind. Many new players find the combat system to be confusing, and it's hard to fault them because the game, unlike other traditional RPGs, doesn't give you any explicit information about what's going on. Why am I missing? Why are my spells failing? What determines success rates? There's no easy way to tell, and you basically just have to guess. Morrowind's combat is based on dice rolls. In a real-time, first-person RPG, this is a questionable decision because what is happening on screen doesn't match what's going on underneath the surface. This is excusable since Arena and Daggerfall were like this too, but the fact that it's based on dice rolls is barely at all communicated to the player, which, on the other hand, is inexcusable. There's no text-based readout that exposes the dice rolls to you, like there is in Neverwinter Nights, or like you might physically understand if you've ever played a tabletop game like Dungeons & Dragons, where you have to do the calculation, rolls, and checks manually. The game does not tutorialize this system whatsoever, beyond telling you which buttons to press to initiate an attack. To figure out that attacks can miss, you have to actually try combat for the first time, and to realize intuitively that it is a dice roll system. There are no special animations for missing an attack, no pop-ups nor graphical indicators, sans the absence of a puff of particle effects. Sure, you can read the tooltips for your stats, but most players aren't really going to check those, and so they're kind of left confused. Giving us simple information during the tutorial about why our attacks are failing would have gone a long way to remedy this problem, and I suspect that the difficulty that newcomers have with Morrowind's combat wouldn't be such a sore spot for their first impressions of the game. I also take issue with the general impression among Morrowind fans that the combat system is really intricate. In truth, Morrowind's combat is faux deep. It seems as if it's very complicated because there is all sorts of mathematics going on behind the scenes, but all of this is kind of obscurant. In reality, those calculations are quite simple, and in regard to the supposed complexity of the system, there isn't even much you can do to alter things. In theory, you could use drain agility to decrease the enemy's ability to dodge and hit, or you could drain fatigue to reduce the enemy's damage and hit chance. But without any kind of statistical readout, it's never clear whether this really gives you a significant benefit, so most players don't even bother, and most people still don't understand how stats impact your combat ability anyway. The magnitude by which a few points in agility determines your chance to hit is also not very great. Most of the time, you'll only be able to drain 10 or 20 points, which isn't very dramatic in reality. The only times understanding the way stats affect combat matters is if you want to break the game. For example, by chugging 10 bottles of Sujamma. Sujamma increases your strength, and the effect, for whatever reason, stacks. If you drink 20 bottles of Sujamma, you can one-shot the most powerful enemies in the game with the weakest weapons. Ironically, what people praise about Morrowind seems to be the fact that it's so poorly designed to the extent that it's utterly broken, or perfectly balanced if you prefer. It just works. Otherwise, success in combat usually just comes down to out-DPSing the enemy, a simple contest of attack and armor stats. In that regard, it isn't really too different from Oblivion nor Skyrim, which are supposedly worse according to fan consensus. The developers did try to add some variety to the game by introducing directional attacks, which basically come in 3 forms. But unfortunately, that isn't very deep either, because none of these attacks actually do anything distinct. They just deal more or less damage depending on which weapon you're using. In fact, this system is so pointless that the developers literally added a setting in the options to always use the best attack. The best attack. Not the most contextually beneficial attack, the best attack. That is, there is no reason for the system to exist at all. If there's going to be a best attack, there might as well only be one attack. It might make sense if thrusting attacks dealt more damage through armor, or if chopping attacks were better against unarmored or lightly armored targets. In other games, there are usually damage types that are relatively better against different things, like in, for example, Warcraft 3. But none of that is implemented here. There's always just one best attack. This is the first in a series of pointless systems that exist in Morrowind that would not even negatively impact the gameplay experience at all if they were just simply removed from the game. Beyond that, there is no depth nor complexity in movement, and movement is a huge part of combat in most games. There are no benefits nor penalties for moving other than draining your fatigue. Enemies will either run straight at you if they're using melee weapons, or they'll try to keep their distance if they're using ranged weapons or magic until they get stuck on a rock. But never will they try to flank you nor manage their distance like a real fighter would, closing in when they're attacking or drawing back when they're defending. At least in Skyrim, NPCs will make a token effort to outmaneuver you and even to keep their distance when they're blocking. They'll try to dodge your spells and arrows, and they'll even take cover if they're using ranged attacks. Some of them are designed to tank damage, and others have combat behaviors that make them really aggressive, so there is some tactical diversity in fighting. Sometimes a warrior, if he is surrounded by allies, will just hold block to defend his friends while they sling arrows and spells at you, or while the rest close in to hit you. The result is that, because NPC behaviors can vary, target prioritization becomes really important. It is a very, very simple system, almost too simple, but already it's far better than in Morrowind. You might think that you can move out of the way to dodge attacks, and so something like light armor would be really good, but this isn't really true. In the first place, armor does not impact your movement speed, so there's basically no reason to not just wear heavy armor. Enemies usually have a pretty long damage range, and your movement speed starts very slow, so you usually cannot move out of range in time to avoid a swing unless you pick a race with a speed bonus, as well as the steed birth sign. As a result, The combat usually feels very static, and you can't possibly outskill or cheese an enemy as you can in Oblivion by just having good movement and block timing. It's usually just like RuneScape, where you stand there trading dice rolls, chugging potions, and auto-attacking until someone is dead. It's not a compelling experience to say the least, and it leaves no room for diversity in warrior builds. The lack of combat stances, movement, or dodging abilities, combat abilities, feats, or anything that might make what already exists slightly deeper and more interesting seriously harms the long-term enjoyability of the game's combat system. The marksman skill is easily the worst approach to combat. Not only are projectiles very slow, but they're even affected by hit chance. You can line up a perfect shot, but unless the dice roll is just right, you will get nothing. Unlike in melee combat, there's a substantial possibility that you can mechanically miss an attack, and on top of that, even if you hit, you could still miss. It's basically just double worse than melee. This might be fine in a game with lock-on combat or turn-based combat where you have no possibility of mechanically missing a target, but it just feels out of place and frustrating in a real-time, first-person experience in which you would ordinarily expect that your attacks would hit. And now we get to the guar in the room, stealth gameplay. Morrowind's stealth is notoriously bad. It's as if the system were just tacked on in the final stages of development before it was shipped out the door. The sneak system works more or less like it does in the future installments. However, there are no NPC schedules. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, since NPCs don't have schedules, there's no way that you can really steal something from a shop without either getting out of sight of the NPC, in which case sneaking is either pointless or you won't be able to steal the item that you want in the first place, or by using magic to game the system, such as sneaking and using telekinesis from across the room, or by using 100% chameleon to break the game, practically making you invisible while still allowing you to perform actions. Perfectly balanced. It turns out that the only way to roleplay as a thief is to be a mage? Clearly, the game was not designed to accommodate this style of gameplay, despite certain points of it pointing to the importance of stealth, such as the thief and shadow birth signs, various enchanted items, certain racial bonuses, the skills clearly marked stealth during character creation, as well as the existence of the Thieves Guild questlines and of the Morag Tong. This is, yet again, another loose end. There are signs here pointing to an intention to make a very deep gameplay experience, but the developers never quite managed to fill up the pool. The last of the three combat archetypes I'll be addressing is magic. Magic in Morrowind isn't that bad, but it's not that great either. It's true that there is an absolute wealth of spell effects in the game, as well as spell making. On paper, a mage character can become extraordinarily powerful beyond the level of a simple warrior. You could use magic to temporarily paralyze people and to stunlock them for the whole encounter, to completely drain their fatigue so they can't hit you, to destroy their stats or their equipment, or to just nuke people with fireballs. You could even levitate or teleport around like some kind of madman. In practice, however, getting to that level takes a very long time, and the point at which you'll be formidable rather than just a liability is so far on the horizon that, most of the time, you'll just feel like a small fish in a big pond. For starters, when your stats are low, there's a significant chance that you'll fail casting a spell. And since the spells that you start with are not necessarily very strong, that means that you can't rely on magic to kill enemies at a low level. You might think that you could just play very carefully to compensate, but magicka doesn't regenerate over time. Once you waste your very small magic pool on failing to cast a few firebolts, you'll just have to fall back on using a sword instead. So once again, combat just defaults back into pushing you into a melee warrior role. Perhaps the worst travesty of the design of the magic system is the fact that, in order to cast lots of spells, or in order to cast very powerful spells, you'll need a big magicka pool. However, to raise your magicka pool sufficiently, you'll have to increase the intelligence attribute. However, the only magic skills that cause it to increase are either not mage skills or are very marginal skills that you'll be using infrequently or never in combat. These include alchemy, conjuration, enchant, and security. Can you see the problem? The two most useful schools of magic that you'll be using on a constant basis, destruction and restoration, don't increase the most important mage attribute, intelligence. Oops, all willpower. And what does willpower increase? Fatigue. Yeah, an important warrior resource. This is good game design, definitely. Sure, you can alleviate this problem somewhat with the mage or the apprentice birth signs, and you can use NPC trainers to give you an intelligence bonus at level up, but it still persists, and it's a big roadblock to becoming a powerful wizard. The fact that repeatedly doing the very thing that wizards rely on does not make you a more powerful wizard is in itself problematic. As a warrior, you get better at warring things by hitting them in the face and by getting hit. As a thief, you get better at thieving things by sneaking around and by plinking doofuses with a bow. As a wizard, you get better at casting spells by picking locks. See the issue? The practical consequence of this travesty is that, if you want to become a powerful mage, you'll have to get used to buying up all of the food in a town, plopping down a stove, and cooking like you're John Breaking Bad. Or you'll have to sit there in the town square and summon skeletons for a month until your brain grows a bit. I guess IQ really is environmental after all. Maybe the problem with Elsewhere is that they just don't have enough skeletons. Either way, this is a really boring and artificial way to grow your character, and almost nobody is going to seriously attempt it. Magic is therefore mostly a dead end unless you're willing to play the game in the most unintuitive way possible. Besides, with the absolute wealth of enchanted items and scrolls available in the loot pool, what's even the point of casting spells? You can find rings that literally deal upwards of 20 damage per hit that allow you to spam fireballs with no rate limit nor animation, and these rings are easily replenished merely by resting for a couple of hours, which you have to do to restore your magicka anyway. You can find scrolls available for a measly few hundred gold that nuke everything within 100 feet. You can buy at level 1 enchanted weapons that paralyze enemies for 30 seconds on hit, and halfway through the main quest, you literally get a pair of pants that allows you to levitate, conveniently right before the Telvanni Hoarder quest, without any need whatsoever to learn how to cast it yourself. Wizards don't use stairs, after all. And even if you know where to look, you can get the wizard staff really early on, which also allows you to levitate. Barring that, you can just buy Rising Force potions for a handful of gold. Magic is not only frustrating, but it's superfluous as well. What's the point of even half of the spell effects in the game? Blind? Why not just paralyze an enemy instead? Drain personality? Really? The Nerevarine could just talk to someone instead, and because he never bathes, it would just have the same effect. Swift Swim? For all of those moments, which I can count on my fingers, where swimming is at all relevant. Again, most of this is faux deep, barely useful fluff that could be removed and no one would miss it. All of the important spell effects, sans levitation of course, were preserved into the future games, and the pointless stuff was just streamlined out, and I can't say that was a bad thing. Even the outright removal of attributes in Skyrim, which critical fans really abhor, was positive in the sense that it made magic more viable. Sure, they could have just fixed the issue with governing attributes and made destruction and restoration intelligence skills, or maybe they could have even just combined intelligence and willpower together and rolled max fatigue into endurance. But removing the intelligence attribute from the game wasn't the worst thing in the world for mages. It still stands that a magic-only playthrough is simply not viable in Morrowind. Only in Oblivion and Skyrim could you even conceive of using solely magic to progress through the game. Again, this is a huge problem for role-playing as well as for class diversity. So that settles it then. The best and most intended way to play through Morrowind with the minimum of frustration and tedium is to just play a big dumb warrior. This is essentially what the game was designed around, but even that isn't as great as it sounds because several of the warrior skills have terrible itemization and probably shouldn't even exist at all, which is part of the reason why they were just removed in future titles. Let's start with spears. Bethesda gets a lot of flack from fans for removing spears from the series. Spears are the most ubiquitous and effective weapon in pre-modernity, so we should expect them to be everywhere in a medieval fantasy world. But after Morrowind, they're not. That's a fair criticism. I mean, the Imperials, who are basically Romans, don't have spears? What? But simultaneously, we have to seriously ask ourselves the question, who even used spears in Morrowind? Why would you ever want to? And does anyone even seriously miss them? Not only are they barely mechanically different from any of the other weapons in the game, having only slightly longer attack range, but the itemization of spears, unlike the other weapon categories, is very poor. Very rarely do you ever encounter an enemy using a spear, so the opportunities to upgrade your weapon are very sparse. Yes, you can get an ebony spear during the Veteran Hoarder quest, and if you feel like cheesing the game, you can just buy one of the enchanted spears from Ravir and Balmora to get the statistically best spear in the game early on. But nevertheless, the itemization is still in general worse than long blades. Several other powerful unique weapons are also long blades, such as the Daedric Crescent, and even in the Tribunal expansion, you get True Flame, which is probably the single most powerful weapon in the game. If you choose to go with spears, you miss out on all of this, and on top of that, The pool of enchanted weapons is very underwhelming for spears, since they are all steel tier or below. Meanwhile, there are enchanted glass longblades that can deal quite a bit of damage you can find simply in the random loot pool. It's not like there weren't cool opportunities to itemize spears. Imagine if, upon killing Vivek, you could get his spear, Muatra. It's just that spears were not really expanded upon in any meaningful way. The reality is that the game is not necessarily made better by having several different types of weapons. At best, the differences are just cosmetic. At worst, it taxes the developers, who have to itemize not just a few categories of weapons, but instead several. If you've ever downloaded a mod for an Elder Scrolls game that adds in hundreds of new melee weapons, you'll know what I'm talking about. They are just stat sticks, and any differences are totally cosmetic. It really doesn't do anything other than to add needless bloat to the game. Maybe in a perfect world, we could have an Elder Scrolls game where each type of weapon is mechanically different, having various strengths and weaknesses, maybe even a more complicated combat system akin to Mountain Blade or Mordhau. Then maybe spears could have a place. But as long as the combat system remains simplified, it's going to be very hard to make a notable gameplay distinction between, say, an axe and a mace, or a spear and a greatsword. It was for the best that Bethesda simplified the weapon categories, first removing spears and alternative weapon styles in Oblivion, and then collapsing all weapons down into either one-handed or two-handed skills. They got rid of the pointless loose ends and a lot of the faux depth, and doubled down on keeping things extremely basic, which they really always were, as long as you could look past the fake complexity and cosmetic variety. It's not like Bethesda dumbed down a complicated system for the masses, but rather, there wasn't much complication to begin with. The last quote-unquote weapon skill I want to address is Unarmed. On paper, Unarmed sounds really good. Attacking enemies with your fists drains their fatigue, and when their fatigue reaches 0, they go unconscious, allowing you to freely hit them and to keep them stun-locked. As a player, it's quite frustrating to fight an unarmed opponent if you don't have restore fatigue potions, so logically, it would be quite effective against NPCs as well. Except, unarmed attacks do very little damage, even to unconscious enemies. If an enemy is wearing heavy armor, just forget about even bothering with unarmed. It's true that you can combine unarmed with a weapon skill and simply switch to a sword when the enemy is unconscious, but every player's dream of playing a fists-only monk character gets dashed. And on top of that, if you insist on using unarmed, you'll just be wasting a lot of time, trading blows with the enemy, losing health, while the enemy merely loses fatigue. If you had just used a real weapon instead, by the time the NPC would have gone unconscious, he would simply be dead. What's the point? Besides, if you have the right custom spells, you can already knock enemies unconscious by simply draining their fatigue to 0. You don't need to rely on unarmed to do this, and if you can paralyze enemies, knocking them unconscious is similarly pointless, so the fact that you can stun enemies with unarmed is not unique. Obviously, it has 0 itemization, unlike in Skyrim, in which you can get a perk that derives bonus unarmed damage from your gauntlet's armor rating. There's nothing of that sort in Morrowind. It even lacks the insane power attack effects that are found in Oblivion's hand-to-hand skill, which makes unarmed very viable in that game, on top of the fact that it directly deals health damage instead of fatigue damage. Unarmed is just not a compelling choice in Morrowind, and because the developers refused to elaborate on its mechanics, it was also for the best that they just straight up removed the unarmed skill from the game in Skyrim. Now let's talk about armor. First, there is medium armor, which also has been removed in subsequent games except for the Elder Scrolls Online. Medium armor is objectively the worst armor type, and it is inferior, in quite literally every way, to both light and heavy armor. The unofficial Elder Scrolls Pages wiki sums up the problem with it perfectly. Of the 3 armor skills, medium armor arguably has the most drawbacks. First of all, the variety of medium armor is much smaller than of light or heavy armor. Secondly, the highest rated medium armor in the unexpanded game is still inferior to the highest rated light and heavy armors in terms of defense rating. Your highest possible armor rating when wearing the best medium armor available at max skill is 145 versus 168 for light armor or 266 for heavy. Also, the best rated medium armor available, Endural armor, is lacking greaves, so if you want the best you can get, you'll have to use Orcish Greaves, which don't match. It is also worth noting that talking to an Ordinator while wearing the Indoril helmet or cuirass will cause them to put you on their death list for the rest of your life. And on top of that, the skill lacks a master trainer. Most of these issues are mitigated by the medium armor found in the Tribunal and the Blood Moon expansions, however. Just like spears, there is a terrible lack of proper itemization, as well as zero mechanical difference between the other categories of item. It's no wonder why they removed this from the future games. Even if you think about it conceptually, medium armor is just a terrible idea because it's impossible to statistically balance, since it has neither the benefits of heavy nor light armor. It's heavier than light armor, but it doesn't protect you as well as heavy armor. So what's the benefit? It's destined to be mediocre no matter how you cut it, never offering you a decisive advantage. The only way they could have fixed this is by adding some sort of feat system, giving you additional perks for wearing it over light or heavy armor. This is, in fact, exactly what the Elder Scrolls Online does. Medium armor is very good for stamina builds in that game because it gives you bonus critical damage. Since Morrowind lacks any kind of feat or perk system, the only real choice is therefore between having as much carry weight as possible or as much protection as possible. Finally, in Morrowind, there is a very curious skill called Unarmored, which is raised when you take damage while not wearing one or more pieces of armor. It is probably the most useless skill, since the max armor rating you can get without using fortify enchantments or potions is 65, well below the upper limit for light, medium, or heavy armor. The only reason you might want to train this skill is if you are playing Khajiit or Argonian, since those races cannot wear boots nor closed helmets. You might have, at max, 2 unarmored slots on your character, so you'll incidentally benefit from this skill. Again, as with the other pointless and shallow skills included in Morrowind, this one was removed in later titles, and we won't miss it. I see pretty much nobody lamenting the loss of Unarmored. Now that combat is out of the way, let's discuss the weaknesses of the game's other skills. The first two that might come to mind are Mercantile and Speechcraft, which are weak and have remained weak in every Elder Scrolls title. The reason for this is that it's virtually impossible to make these skills relevant in a computer game versus a traditional tabletop RPG. In a tabletop game, the limit on the scope of dialogue is quite literally the extent of the dungeon masters and players' imaginations. The dialogue is infinitely flexible and can encompass anything the players want to do or to say. However, in a computer game, there's only a finite amount of content that must follow very specific rules. The option to bluff or to negotiate must be intended and implemented by the developers in any given situation. This taxes the programmers, quest designers, and the writers to a great extent, and there isn't always much time in the development cycle to represent the total amount of role-playing possibilities one should logically have. In a game with small scale, like Fallout 1, this isn't a big issue, but in a massive open world with almost 1,000 characters, you can start to see why it just isn't possible to make speech or dialogue intricate, and therefore to make a skill based entirely around speech useful. The failure to properly implement role-playing skills isn't a problem specific to Morrowind, but it behooves me to mention it. Let's also discuss the Mercantile skill. Mercantile is very simple. The higher it is, the better deals you get at shops. However, to raise it, you need to haggle and to repeatedly buy and sell goods, netting you only a minuscule amount of XP each time. If you can find someone who has reached level 100 Mercantile in Morrowind without going out of his way to do so, I'll eat my hat. Not only is the benefit for doing so totally unworthwhile, but it's extremely tedious to accomplish. The only way I can see the implementation of a skill like Mercantile not being utterly worthless is if the game had infrequently used skill checks and dialogue, which Morrowind does not. A character with high Mercantile might be able to resolve quests, or to easily settle negotiations in some way that involves his particular expertise as a deal maker. The same could be said about Speechcraft, which could function like the skill does in the Fallout games, allowing you to convince NPCs to do your bidding, or even to deftly reason with them, in order to resolve conflicts or to get your way. If the speech skill were done right, you should feel like you have a silver tongue, able to talk your way out of any situation. But similarly to Mercantile, there's essentially no benefit to raising the skill to 100. The number of times in which the skill is relevant in-game is very small. Even when you have an opportunity to convince someone to do something, like, let's say, during the Hordator quests, you could also just as easily progress by either killing the characters using the taunt feature, or by bribing them with the thousands of gold you inevitably have in your inventory, since there isn't really a gold sink in Morrowind. Even the way bribery is implemented is questionable. For some reason, the game allows you to bribe someone with 1 gold. 1 gold. If you hypothetically tried to bribe someone in real life by giving him a penny, he would feel insulted and would probably laugh you out of the room. Why is this even an option? You can also choose to bribe someone for 100 or 1000 gold respectively. Usually the 1000 gold option isn't necessary, and it's better to simply bribe in 100 gold increments. Oblivion significantly improved this system by cutting out the unnecessary choices, therefore reducing the cost of bribery to a simple speechcraft calculation, which usually comes out to about 70 gold. Ultimately, the speech and disposition system in this game is still rudimentary and without any degree of elaboration. It's a simple roadblock to quest completion in the majority of cases that boils down to forcing the player to click on some buttons repeatedly until he can progress. It does not improve immersion, nor is it compelling mechanically. It's just not fun. Disposition was removed in Skyrim for the most part, except for a simple friend or enemy system, and Mercantile was rolled into speech, which remained similarly useless, since Skyrim has even fewer points at which you can convince someone to do something than the previous two games. I fully expect speech to just be removed in the Elder Scrolls 6 as a whole, and if Bethesda isn't willing to make the system more complex, and to give it any serious implementation, or to intertwine it with dialogue in a compelling way, then it can only be a good decision. Yes, sure, the RPG mechanics are being dumbed down, but they were already dumb in the first place. Other skills are simply redundant or obtuse. Take enchanting, for instance. The ability to enchant your weapons on the go sounds really good. It could add much needed custom utility to your character. It brings to mind 20th level Dungeons & Dragons wizards crafting the most absurdly powerful magic items possible. However, taking this skill is questionable when NPCs provide competent enchantment services at reasonable prices in every major town. Unless you're willing to dehumanize yourself and face to grinding, they'll do a much better job at it as well. Raising the enchantment skill is inefficient and slow. First, you'll need a wealth of items to enchant. Second, you'll need a plethora of filled soul gems. Getting those is already difficult and expensive, so how do you fill soul gems? You need to have the ability to trap souls, and since you need to roam around the map to find enemies to slay, it can be quite annoying. You need to do this thousands of times before your enchanting skill is anywhere reasonable enough to be useful. On the other hand, you could always just skip the tedium and walk into the Mages Guild. Or you could just buy or find the enchanted items you need, which isn't hard at all. Alchemy also sounds quite good on paper. Having the ability to make a ton of health potions or fatigue potions, or even magicka potions on hand would be a great benefit, and it would make your potion economy very efficient. And yet, alchemy equipment is very heavy and generally unworth carrying around versus, say, a bunch of repair hammers. And since you have a very good chance of failing to make potions, it isn't viable unless you've leveled the skill up. Leveling alchemy is a slog, and pretty much no one manages to do it. On top of that, the alchemy interface is a disaster. Oblivion improved on this by simply displaying only the ingredients that are compatible with the selected ingredient. Skyrim improved alchemy even further by simply allowing you to sort specifically by which potion you want to make. Morrowind's alchemy system is just inferior in every way, and it is not mechanically complex either. It is borderline useless. Once again, Morrowind reveals to the player that the optimum build and the most viable build is simply a warrior class, without any of that pesky crafting nonsense. In theory, Morrowind should have great class differentiation because of the available degree of skills. However, since most of these skills suck, the specializations also suck, and you just get railroaded into playing warrior again. Everything is very shallow, and there's nothing much deeper than just swinging a sword at something until it dies. Skyrim has a similar problem due to the lack of attribute specializations, and so everyone just ends up playing some kind of battle mage or magic stealth archer who just kind of does a little bit of everything. Only Oblivion managed to get it kind of right by making all three archetypes, mage, warrior, and thief, viable and unique, despite all the other problems with that game's leveling and RPG systems. Morrowind's quest design, like most of the game, is painfully simplistic. The vast majority of quests in the game wouldn't be out of place in an MMO. Go here, find this, kill 3 wolves, get Red Eyes, McAshface, and MacGuffin, you get the idea. I'll acknowledge that the writing is good, and characters behave believably according to the situation they're in, what their background and race is, and also according to the reputation of the player character. For example, Ordinators will attack you at some point in the main quest since you are, according to Temple Doctrine, a heretic. There is also some inter-faction conflict written into the game, which is a welcome addition. These small changes contribute toward making the world Despite how dead and static it really is, feels somewhat alive. In all of these categories, Morrowind is vastly superior to the future games. But when we look past the writing and the flavor text and examine what the player is actually doing in these quests, what the gameplay really consists of, we find that the quests are generally no more complicated than those in Oblivion or Skyrim, and you are almost never confronted with an interesting choice to make. The quests are very, very linear. Most of the time, you're just walking somewhere, talking to someone, traveling around the map, talking to a slew of other people, and occasionally visiting a dungeon or bashing someone's stupid skull in. And it's a shame too, because the first little mini-quest you're introduced with in Morrowind is the choice to either give the Ring of Healing to Fargoth or to keep it for yourself. And then, when you're tasked with retrieving it again, you can choose to abscond with the money or to give it back. The sad fact of the matter is that the precedent that this sets and all of the little choices that you can make are relegated to just a few quests, and the possibility of playing a self-interested character, fighting back against fate and prophecy, or swindling and cheating people remains off the table. If you want to actually roleplay, Morrowind proves to be just as disappointing as Skyrim. Now, I have to talk about the main quest because it isn't as interesting as people make it out to be. First of all, it itself is painfully linear. At a few points, the game makes some pretenses of non-linearity, politely nudging the player to complete some side content in order to grow stronger and to develop your stats. However, none of this is actually necessary. When Caius Cosades tells you to complete freelance work and to come back a couple of days later, you can literally just wait in his house and he'll give you your next orders, no matter if you've grown in strength. The main quest is paced such that never at any point are you too weak to confront the challenges that it throws at you. It is designed around a given pace of character development that naturally unfolds as you tackle the main quests themselves. In other RPGs, especially CRPGs, you will frequently hit barriers for progress that require you to strengthen your character and the rest of your party. In Pillars of Eternity, this happens quite frequently, and you'll have to give up for a time and start tackling side content and picking up new party members in order to prepare you for what comes next. This also happens in Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, where you sometimes have to squeeze out every little bit of possible XP on the map in order to stay relevant. This is especially true on higher difficulties. I can say the same for Pathfinder Kingmaker as well as for Neverwinter Nights. Morrowind, even though it is perceived as akin to a classic RPG, is really closer to Oblivion, in the sense that it never puts the player outside of his comfort zone, and it never sets him up for failure if he's not sufficiently prepared. The game is difficult only if you make it so. For this reason, even the level scaling in Oblivion and Skyrim is a significant departure in terms of pacing or challenge from Morrowind, where you only get destroyed if you decide to visit some off-the-road high-level dungeons. When you're tasked with single-handedly wiping out a 6th house base, it's an absolute pushover. Even in Skyrim, this is true. You can complete the main quest at level 1 if you so desire, but you'll still get killed if you try to defeat a giant or a dragon priest. If you're so inclined, you can even complete Morrowind itself at level 1 as long as you have some smart itemization. You can even just go directly to Red Mountain as long as you have Wraithguard, Sunder, and Keening, and defeat Dagoth-Ur, which in truth is not very hard to do, since you basically just have to hack and slash at the heart of Lorkhan a few times. Only in the DLCs, which are intended for high-level characters, do you ever feel like you have to level up to progress. The absolute trough of the main quest design, and of the quest design in general, is during the Horderer segment, which requires you to circumnavigate Morrowind and to convince several counselors to give you their vote. It can take hours, and since there is no fast travel, it's quite tedious and boring. The process of convincing the counselors to give you their vote was a great opportunity to provide choices to the player and to implement the speechcraft skill properly. However, we learn that for every faction, there is at least one counselor who will, no matter what you do, not give you their vote. You end up simply having to kill them. Nope, you cannot use your silver tongue to convince them out of their intransigence, and you cannot get them to care in any way, shape, or form about the coming Ashblight apocalypse, nor about the Nerevarine prophecy. This is the deep and immersive RPG that people have been telling me about, I guess. And then, after that, you have to do it all over again, except this time with the remote Ashlander tribes. Perhaps the closest equivalent to this quest is the Support for Bruma quest in Oblivion, which is notorious and widely hated because of both its repetition and because of the requirement to travel all around the map to every major city. But thankfully, unlike in Morrowind, this quest is completely optional. Why people uncritically praise Morrowind's main quest over Oblivion's, I do not know. I'd hazard a guess that those who remember Morrowind fondly have completely forgotten about this, and instead they remember only the climactic battle against Dagoth-Ur and a few highlights, such as meeting Devaeth Fear or Yagram Bagarn, or perhaps they never even completed the main story to begin with. It's an example of cognitive bias and selective memory. If you remember Morrowind fondly, I highly suggest that you go back and replay it, especially the main quest. Why don't you even try to play it in a suboptimal way too? Try being a pure mage, or even a stealth character. Good luck. I guarantee you that it's significantly worse than you remember, once you are no longer bewitched by the setting and the art style. When the hype of the first impressions wears off, and when you can start experiencing the game more critically, the weaknesses really start to show. Elsewhere in Morrowind's quest, we don't even see the kinds of interesting or exciting set pieces that we might find in Oblivion or Skyrim. This is not necessarily a bad thing. An RPG can be great without reliance on set pieces or on jumping the shark, and once you've seen it once, it's no longer surprising or interesting. But at the same time, they can create memorable moments and really solidify the climax of the storyline. That moment in the Oblivion Fighters Guild quest where it's revealed that you just slaughtered a village of innocent people after being drugged with tainted hiss sap is very memorable. Likewise, visiting Sovngarde in Skyrim is awesome, but there's nothing like that in Morrowind at all. Perhaps Morrowind compensates with fantastic writing and quest design? Not really. Let's take the Fighters Guild, for instance. It consists almost exclusively of generic dungeon delving, and even a couple of quests where literally all you do is deliver some alcohol to people like a lowly porter. The biggest plot twist is that the guild is infiltrated by the Komoda Tong, and so you have to kill a few characters, but that's it. Really, the only impactful moment is the finale, when you are tasked to kill the leader of the Thieves Guild, posing as an interesting dilemma for a player who is trying to complete all the guilds at once. You have to complete them in a specific order. First the Thieves Guild, and then the Fighters Guild. That's kind of the extent of player choice in Morrowind's quest design. I appreciate that they give you the freedom to fail, but at the same time, this is really all that there is. The most disappointing faction is perhaps House Telvanni, the mythical and magical house of wizard lords, in which the only rule is the will to power. Telvanni lords earn their right to preside within the house by killing other lords. It's one of the most interesting and unique factions in Morrowind, but the kicker is that almost all of their quests are generic fetch quests. You're just a slave boy for the wizard lords. You don't get to take part in their intrigue, with the exception of killing a couple of people for Arion. You don't get to participate in their arcane secrecy. No, you're just a mule desperately trying to prove himself in a faction where the only acceptable proof is to just kill the leaders. The Telvanni are long-lived mages and sorcerers who have managed to use magic to artificially extend their lives, to expand their minds to the level of demigods, and, despite being few in number, to exercise a disproportionate amount of control over Morrowind's politics. No one understands the mysteries of Aetherius like they do, and yet, you don't even get to share in this power whatsoever. What a disappointment. Speaking of disappointments, there's yet another loose end to talk about, the Imperial Cult and the Imperial Legion quests. Both remain quite unfinished, and the quests are very phoned in, which is why modders have tried to expand them. I wouldn't even fault you for not realizing that these quest lines exist in the game, since they're so marginal and out of the way. To join the Imperial Legion, you have to enter the outpost in Nisus, which I'm sure plenty of players have outright missed. In the cult faction, most of the time you'll just be collecting donations and items. Occasionally, you'll get tasked to kill some ghosts or vermin. Again, the Nerevarine is reduced to being an errand boy. As for the Imperial Legion, the list of quests is even smaller, coming in at only 9, although some of them are genuinely interesting since you spend a lot of time unraveling plots and pulling off rescues. Were it actually finished, it would have been quite a compelling experience, but sadly, like most of the game, it was left undercooked. Then there's the Vivec Arena. Unlike Oblivion, despite the existence of an arena in the game, there are no specific arena questlines, no scheduled matches, or anything of the sort. The only time that the game has a use for the arena is in a few faction-related quests, where you must duel certain people to become the head of the guild. Even that is kind of absurd, because why would the head of a guild have to duel the Nerevarine to the death, rather than simply abdicating his position? Anyway, it really feels like there should have been something here, but I suppose that there simply wasn't enough time to actually implement anything. Again, because Morrowind didn't have much time in the oven, this is disappointing and empty. The last part of the game's quest design and writing that I want to address is the fundamental lack of interesting and impactful choices to be made by the player. Will Wright, creator of the Sims franchise, once said, "A game is an interesting series of choices," and he's right. A linear game practically plays itself, but a multiform game with many choices to be made by the player is actually properly interactive. This is the fundamental difference between a book or a movie and a video game. The outcome of a game changes depending upon player input, or at least that's how it should be. Games are an active experience. This is the one thing that makes them unique. Unfortunately, Morrowind only has a single ending, and your choices do not matter. You, the chosen hero, always defeat Dagoth-Ur and restore peace to Morrowind. And when you finally confront the devil, the Sharmot, Dagoth-Ur, who you've heard so much about, he doesn't ask you to join him. Rather, he asks you what you would have done if you had joined him. And the last sentence in his response to any choice is, "I will let you have the first blow." There could have been a great moment, akin to Darth Vader asking Luke to join the dark side, but that doesn't happen. The premise of the game's story indicates that this should be otherwise. Several times, Dagoth-Ur and his servants offer for the Nerevarine to join forces with the Sixth House, and to drive the Tribunal and the Empire out of Morrowind, and to grant immortality to everyone. Nerevar would, in theory, have a good reason to do so. The Tribunal betrayed him at Red Mountain, and Nerevar could want to make amends with his old friend, Lord Dagoth, who he trusted so long ago. But never in the game are you confronted with a choice to join the Sixth House, despite Dagoth-Ur begging you to. Even if he didn't want to join the Sixth House, why can't the Nerevarine just use the Heart of Lorkhan and the tools of Kagrenac to make himself a living god? Why not just kill Dagoth-Ur and usurp the power for yourself? Or perhaps, just as one dialogue option implies, why doesn't the Nerevarine just activate a Kukulkan and take over Tamriel for himself? With the exception of just outright killing essential NPCs, there's no way to choose to shirk your destiny as the Nerevarine, to piss off Azura, nor to alter the events of history. Every time you play Morrowind, everything turns out exactly the same no matter which path you take. You could do something as insane as to kill Vivec and to steal Wraithguard from him, and you could still complete the game with the help of Yagra and Bagarn. Nothing changes in the end, despite Morrowind losing its beloved God King Emperor. Bardal, the meteor kept miraculously floating above Vivec's city by the power of Vivec's divinity, still remains floating there for inexplicable reasons even after his death, even though we now know in the lore that after Vivec's disappearance in the Fourth Era, the meteor came crashing down, obliterating the city and causing Red Mountain to erupt again, making Vardenfell mostly uninhabitable. Why doesn't Vivec's death in Morrowind cause a similar disaster, which the player will have to live with? This probably again owes to the game's short development cycle, but the fact remains that in Morrowind, there are almost never any points at which you can make decisions that affect the course of the plot or the game world. I hear a lot of people praising Morrowind as a deep and intricate RPG, especially in comparison against Oblivion and Skyrim, but I just don't see it. Unlike other RPGs, there are not pivotal choices to make, such as when you choose between siding with Roche or with the Scoia'tael in The Witcher 2, revealing two very different paths through the main story. Nor is it like Fallout New Vegas, where siding with one faction or the other drastically changes the outcome of the story and the impact that your actions have on the wasteland. And it's definitely not like Fallout 1, where you can choose to side with the Master, the main antagonist of the game. There are typically not even micro choices as you might find even in small side quests in The Witcher 3. Overall, Morrowind remains an underdeveloped and shallow RPG experience, just like the other Elder Scrolls games. Beyond the fact that the player can decide his class, his race, and his skills, Morrowind just does not offer an interesting series of choices, at least as far as the narrative is concerned. The future Elder Scrolls titles also share this problem. Why can't the hero of Kvatch join the Mythic Dawn? Why can't the Dragonborn decide that, according to metaphysical necessity, the world should just be allowed to end out of reverence for the Wand and his will? Even Paarthurnax entertains the fact that the world must end at some point, and that the Dragonborn is merely pushing back the inevitable in order to vainly hold on to the temporal and mortal world, the House of Sithis. Why isn't the option to stand back and let it happen available, or even to join forces with Alduin somehow, under the idea that Alduin is just an aspect of Akatosh? There are even in-game books that debate this, such as the Alduin-Akatosh dichotomy and Alduin is real. We should be left to ourselves to decide whether the Nords are right and Alduin is a malevolent enemy, or if the other scholars are right and Alduin is simply a necessary aspect of Akatosh as the god of time, whose purpose is to fulfill the eschatological role of ending things, the very end of time. Why couldn't we alternatively choose to join with the Thalmor and to hasten the end of the accursed plane of Lorkhan? The idea of the flexibility of fate and destiny is central to the metaphysical laws of the Elder Scrolls, so why does the narrative never reflect that in choice? All of this comes back to Morrowind and its fundamental decision to make the player a metaphysical hero, possibly even an incarnation of Lorkhan in some form, who can and must follow a given path. Perhaps this also stretches back to Daggerfall as well, although that's debatable. And no, I don't think the fact that you can kill essential plot NPCs is a narrative choice, since it essentially just ends up soft-locking you. It does not have a special ending where Dagoth-Ur emerges victorious and becomes king of the world. It is essentially, therefore, no narrative importance. It is almost akin to just quitting the game. People say that your character in the Elder Scrolls is a blank slate, and so it's almost a perfect opportunity for role-playing. But this premise is just patently false. The Elder Scrolls has this lack of choice chiefly because of its insistence that the player is the chosen one, the incarnation of a dead god, who goes by many names such as Ysmir, Talos, Wolfhearth, Pelinal, Underking, Shazar, and so on, since he's really just the same figure each time. This is why you can't join the Thalmor in Skyrim, because you are Lorkhan, the very god that they hate. This is why you can't let the world in, because the world is your own plane of existence. You always start in prison, because like Lorkhan, you are chained to the earth and condemned to forever walk upon it. Unlike in Fallout, the player isn't just a random person in a desperate situation who can choose to be either a hero or a villain, or to succeed or to fail. Instead, he has a given role, a given purpose, interwoven into the very fabric of the Orbis, the universe itself. What flexibility is there in role-playing when this is the case? You are the almost Promethean hero of this story, and despite the fact that the fate of the world and its people lies in your hands, you cannot choose other than to save it, to preserve the mortal, temporal limitation, to bring fire down from heaven into the dark limits of creation, as the elves might see it. You can have any flavor you like as long as it's Patamaic. And sure, it's debatable whether the material plane, the Mundus, is good or evil, whether it is the House of Sithis, or just the eminent creation of Akatosh and the One. That obviously depends on one's moral perspective, but never can you choose to depart from your character's express purpose, to preserve material reality. There's a whole wealth of spiritual depth to the lore of the Elder Scrolls, but rarely does the narrative allow you to make contact with the questions of that world. You are always the hero, you are always saving the earth and its mortal people. This does not change and will never change. Speaking of disappointing and empty, let's talk about Morrowind's world design. I hear quite a lot of praise for Vardenfell's locales, but quite frankly, this doesn't resonate with me while I'm playing. Most of Vardenfell consists of swampland, an ashy wasteland broken apart by mostly impassable cliffs that wouldn't look out of place in Fallout, and empty plains full of, well, nothing. By the standards of 2002, it is quite breathtaking as an open world. The flora and fauna are creatively designed, and it's fun for at least a little while to explore and to take in the sights. But once you've seen a few swamps and hills, you've kind of seen everything, because it's just that, but copied and pasted ad nauseum. People are really exaggerating how great Morrowind's world design is, because not only is it not much better than Oblivion or Skyrim, but it's even sparser. Due to limitations on render distance, everything is covered in an obscure and ugly fog. The scale of the world is in reality very tiny, and it only feels enormous because of the impassable barriers at every turn, as well as the player's snail-like movement speed. It's not necessarily bad that the world is small, but you would expect that a smaller scale means that it would be more densely packed with distinct content. However, it's not. Morrowind, just like the future titles, is full of pointless little dungeons, small in size, that serve more or less as filler, full of recycled enemies and loot. It's wide as an ocean and deep as a puddle, just as people say about the other two games. And similarly, the map is full of locations that serve practically no purpose. There are little estates, farmhouses, and villages everywhere. We might think of Rorikstead and Skyrim, for example, that have nothing to do with the player. I appreciate that the developers at least tried to represent how Morrowind as a society feeds its people, but it remains to be said that these areas are empty and otherwise without interest. You won't find any interesting quests here, and there are no little problems to solve like there might be in The Witcher 3. There's just nothing. The most you will accomplish by picking a direction and running is wasting your time and inching your fingers a bit closer to carpal tunnel syndrome. Everything worthwhile in Morrowind usually takes place through structured questing and narrative, but as I pointed out repeatedly, the developers simply didn't have the time to cover every inch of Morrowind's game space in exposition and elaboration, so the result is that vast amounts of land and many locations go underutilized. Bethesda got way better at environmental storytelling in other games, especially Skyrim. Several Dwemer ruins make their function and purpose evident. For example, Bethardom's is a marketplace, which is revealed by the existence of shop stalls and valuable merchandise. Even some of the ancient Nord crypts have features such as throne rooms or altars, depicting what their purpose was long ago. In Morrowind, however, little attempt appears to have been made to make these small locations come alive. Dungeons are simply hallways full of enemies and occasionally some loot. They are mostly interchangeable with one another, and they're almost always very short in length. It's not like Morrowind is completely without memorable dungeons. Arkingthan comes to mind, and Kolgaran with its Lovecraft-esque vibes and head-scratching furniture arrangements, but typically, if the dungeon isn't associated with the main quest or a faction quest, it is woefully neglected by the design team. Both Arkingthan and Kolgaran are main quest locations. Sure, I will grant that a little bit of environmental storytelling is negligible, and it won't make or break the experience. The narrative and player choice always comes first, but a detailed environment with a lot of attention to detail can really enhance the experience and immerse the player. Sadly, Morrowind falls short in this regard. Overall, Morrowind's world design is good enough for the purposes of the game, but generally speaking, it's not outstanding, and it's definitely not better than Oblivion nor Skyrim. It shares similar flaws and it's similarly empty, but it's without the grandeur of Skyrim's majestic mountain peaks, nor the lush forests and beautiful rolling fields of Cyrodiil. With the exception of the occasional atmospheric thrill of an ash storm, the unique side of a Telvanni wizard tower, or the eerie vibe of Red Mountain inside the Ghost Fence, there isn't much worthy of noting in Morrowind's environment unless you really think mushroom trees are the most creative thing in the world. Exploring Morrowind feels like coming across otherworldly curiosities, interspersed by long moments of excruciating mundanity, a few gems amidst piles of absolute coal. We tend to remember the odd plants and animals and the highlights of the experience, but people tend to forget how boring the rest of the world truly is, which is unfortunately where you'll be spending most of your time in-game. Even the highlights are often sort of disappointing. Vivec looks impressive from the outside, but each of the cantons has more or less the same contents and layout. Meanwhile, in Oblivion, even the most remote and pointless section of the wilderness is starkly beautiful. In Skyrim, the misty peaks of the mountains are visible at all times, and possibly the peak of Bethesda's environment design was the Shivering Isles DLC. But in Morrowind, you will mainly be taking in the sights of the same barren hills, the same rocky cliffs, and the same pools of mud and sludge that you've seen countless times before. Maybe the fantastical art direction makes up for it when we look at Morrowind from a bird's eye view, but we cannot deny that things are mostly pretty lame from the ground. It's kind of hard for me to criticize something that I love so much. I have extremely fond memories of Morrowind from years ago, back when I first played it. Getting a chilling fright when that message pops up for killing a main character was always surprising, and when I finally was able to defeat Dagoth-Ur, I felt like a true hero. Few games are ballsy enough to allow you to outright softlock yourself just for the sake of allowing a modicum of player freedom. It's amazing that the game has the courage to allow you to fail. But as I've shown, most of the stuff is just kind of key jangling. In the actual substance of Morrowind itself, player choices virtually never factors in. It's not respected nor catered to. I hope that my criticisms have caused you to have a more accurate picture of Morrowind, and perhaps even a greater appreciation of the future Elder Scrolls titles, even though they may be flawed and even worse in some ways. Thank you for watching, and have fun.